Okay, guys, welcome to our next lecture, Competing Visions of the Virtuous Republic, the period from 1776 to 1795. Now, we knew what we didn't like, and we knew that we wanted to build a republic, but what kind of republic were we going to build? What kind of republic? Ready for the next slide? Notions of republicanism. Now, some, like Thomas Paine, declared that republicanism was a moral code of behavior as well as a system of government. I mean, he said the equality of rights, you don't have to write this down. The equality of rights is clear and simple. Every man can understand it. By understanding his rights, he learns his duties. Every man must see the necessity of protecting the rights of others as the most effectual security for his own rights. In other words, if you don't want to lose free speech, don't say everything you want to say. Kind of very limiting. Now, why would he be so scared about trying to build a republic? After all, I mean, enlightened people know that people, not kings, rule. Well, the problem with republics, though, is look at history. Going to the next slide. Republics are inherently fragile. I mean, Greece and its years as a democracy, that only lasted 140 years. Rome, well, it was a republic for 400 years, but then it turned into a dictatorship underneath the Caesars. England, the mother country, they were a republic for 12 years before they turned back and pled for a king to take them back over. Indeed, Thomas Paine said, "The mere independence of America did not constitute a true revolution if the leaders of the new nation chose to model their government after the corrupt system of the English government." So how are we going to be different? Solutions. Well, a lot of people believed that they were really taken away with Adam Smith's emphasis on self-interest and thought that laissez-faire government was the best, meaning that the government does as little as possible to interfere with a business. If you want a good example of this, of the government not regulating a business, cell phones. Cell phones were originally created as kind of fancy walkie-talkies, but now you have a cell phone. It's a camera. It's an internet hotspot. It's a thing to do apps and take pictures. Because basically the government has very few laws regulating it. Same thing used to be with vape shops. Ready for the next slide? Well, also the social context of what's going on right now is you have a lot of tension between the backcountry and the wealthy elite. The backcountry folks don't trust the wealthy elite, and they think local power is best, because that's where you're most able to change and your vote is the strongest. The wealthy elites, meanwhile, thought that the backcountry were untrained, uneducated, uncouth. Basically, they believed power was best if it was centralized, with uniform rule and procedures set up for everybody where people could best pursue individual interest. Getting ready to go to the next slide. So we don't have a strong centralized power right now, but what do we have? State constitutions. And in the state constitutions, there was no real agreement on who the people were. Who do I mean when I say the people? Who was it that could vote and participate in electing officials? If one thinks about it, true democracy is a frightening prospect. I mean, John Adams, in discussing who should be able to vote, stated there will be no end of it. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights are not enough attended to, and every man who has not a farthing will demand an equal voice with any other in all acts of state. And guys, this was totally frightening. We're kind of used to it now, but America is nothing but a great experiment, which is an awesome experiment. So to help try to kind of explain this, we're going to look at the state constitutions of two different states with the division of powers between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Now, Pennsylvania basically did away with property requirements and gave the right to vote to all white males. Maryland, meanwhile, they kept property qualifications for voting high, and even higher property qualifications if you wanted to run for office. The reason why they did that is because they believed if you had a lot of land, then you wouldn't be affected by bribes. Pennsylvania, meanwhile, in the construction of their government, all power was given to a unicameral legislature or a one-house legislature, and they had no governor. And to make sure that the people that were elected remained attentive to their constituents' needs and wants, they had annual elections, or elections every year, so they would be held accountable. In Maryland, meanwhile, they gave power to a governor and a two-house legislature underneath him. That's called a bicameral legislature. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, the other states fell between these two extremes, like New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Georgia. They were like Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, New York, South Carolina, and Virginia were like Maryland. As was New Jersey. But an interesting thing in New Jersey, because it didn't put a gender qualification on property ownership, if you were a woman who owned property from 1776 to 1807, you could vote in New Jersey if you were a woman and a property owner. Well, what happened after 1807? Well, New Jersey closed the loophole. Ready to go to the next slide? All right, state constitutions again. So even though you had this original outburst of constitutions beginning in the late 1780s, you start to have a new set of constitutions that expanded the power of the state governments and started to restrict voting and office holding to property owners. But on the other hand, checks and balances and bills of rights restricted the power of the state governments. Well, what about the national document? Well, the Articles of Confederation would be that national document. And this was a struggle to write. It took more than 6 years with numerous authors that tried to write this unifying constitution. First guy that took a stab at it was Ben Franklin, who turned in his draft in 1775, which the delegates turned down. 6 months later, another copy was attempted by John Dickinson, who drafted a proposed constitution in 1775. Dickinson was a Philadelphia lawyer and pamphleteer. Congress, well, they revised the draft in 1775 to 76 by reducing the power of the national government. The states then took up the proposal in 1777, but couldn't come to an agreement until 1781. So about the time that our actual war, Revolutionary War on land was over here, we finally have a government. Now, what did the articles say? Well, here's a quick examination of all the articles. Fun things to know is it was the Articles of Confederation. You don't have to write all these down. But it gave us the name United States. Also, I love this one, Canada. You're free to come join us anytime you want to. But if you look at these, look, state, states, state, state, states, state. All debts are paid out of common treasury. State, 9 states. Basically, all the power is in the states. Ready to go to the next slide? The Confederation government. Basically, they tried to create a national government that was as weak as possible, with the states supreme. Why? Well, to ensure the sovereignty of the states. The government was made of a unicameral legislature or a one-house legislature. Where each state had one vote. The Confederate government couldn't tax or regulate trade. But in a curious move, underneath the Articles of Confederation, slaves were counted in full for taxes. In other words, they were counted as or regarded as people rather than property. Now, this was not popular with southern states who were taxed heavier, but it could be seen as a stand against slavery in that it made it more expensive. And about the only way the national government could make money was by selling land. But the sale of land would get complicated. Why? Well, because you see, there are all these colonies, but some of these colonies had claims outside of their own state. Like what would become Vermont, that was claimed by New York. Over here on the side of Pennsylvania, that was claimed by Connecticut. Virginia, basically, they could stretch all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, as could North Carolina, as could South Carolina, as could Georgia. And who would control those lands basically delayed ratification of the new government until 1781. The smaller landlocked states like Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, they refused to ratify it unless that land was given up to the national government. Indeed, Maryland said, no national domain for these lands, then there's going to be no ratification. And finally, Virginia, seeing that we needed a unifying national government, they take the lead in renouncing their Western claims. In order to achieve ratification, and the other states quickly follow. Challenges to the Confederation. All right, guys, we are in a huge depression and financial crisis. In the post-war depression and financial crisis, the post-war depression affected the entire country. The toll of fighting a protracted war on our land was obvious. Pennsylvania, New Jersey bore the scars of rape and looting by British soldiers. You had streams of refugees pouring in from the south. Livestock and crops had been stolen or destroyed. And to compound things, in New England, insects wiped out the crops. So this economic downturn affected all classes. Meanwhile, our merchants had very limited markets. England barred American products and limited American ships in the Caribbean colonies. So because we don't have places to sell our goods, like the New England fisheries, by 1786, we're only operating at 80% of what they were doing during the war. Our farmers couldn't sell their goods, or grain, or rice. So this depression hurt not only farmers, but shipbuilders as well. Thomas Jefferson desperately tried to gain more contacts in France for us. Meanwhile, the value of our paper money plunged. During the war, we had printed out $240 million of paper money, and it's estimated that the British flooded our currency with counterfeit Continentals, about $80 million worth. And this money was only backed not on gold or silver, but only good faith in the American government. So its value plunged so bad that even the government itself does not accept the paper money for taxes. A popular saying was that something wasn't worth a Continental. So how is the government going to save itself? Ready for the next slide? There was an attempted solution. In this attempted solution, Robert Morris proposed a tariff on imported goods to pay off the foreign loans that had been taken out by government. The only problem with this was that the government was restricted and couldn't tax any trade. So a vote had to be called, even though Morris asked for only a 5% tax on imported goods. And the states, particularly Rhode Island and Virginia, totally refused, causing Morris to retire in disgust. One critic of the government stated, 13 wheels require a steady and powerful regulation to keep them in good order, and until Congress could act in unanimity, nothing could prevent this machine from becoming useless. Well, what was the one way that the government could make money? If you remember, that was through the sale of land. The Northwest Ordinances. Basically, to raise money, the government decided to sell its land in the Northwest Territory. And you had the Ordinance of 1784. which created 5 new states: Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan. Each state would have a status equal to the older states. And it set up the process for how one went from a territory to a state. At the first stage, a governor would be appointed. As the population grew, it would move on to the second stage, where a representative assembly elected by the people would be allowed. And as the population continued to grow, it would reach the third stage. And in the third stage, a state constitution would be drafted. Well, the Ordinance of 1785 set up the system for selling the land. Now, money was needed badly, so they established the lots basically to sell the land, creating these townships that would cover 6 square miles. This would be broken down into 36 640-acre lots. And they tried to not see speculators get rich over this, so they tried not to sell it to private companies, but instead to citizens. The only problem with this is, let's say you got a 640-acre lot, you only charge $1 an acre. Well, that means you need $640 to buy that land. And by 1815, I think, the average American farmer, his net worth was only $200. So way back in 1885, there's no way that farmers could go out and afford that land. So they said, okay, we'll sell it to private groups. Now, what did that mean? Let's say you're a farmer and you have $200. Well, it's still not $640. So what you do is you get together with somebody else, and now you have $400. Well, you need to get another partner, that's $600. Well, heck, let's get another partner, that's $800. You buy one of those 640-acre lots. And what you can do is you can break that 640 acres down into smaller sizes and sell it to a farmer, sell him 100 acres for $125 at 25% profit. Well, people can afford that. They couldn't afford the 640. So as soon as you allow some entrepreneurship in there, the land, people start buying it left and right. And I mean, the government had hired all these surveyors to cordon off the lands. In each of the little townships, you can see they set up a township where this is where the church is going to be, this is where the stables are going to be, this is where the dry goods store is going to be. So people started flooding into the area. So much so that it wasn't long before they realized they had to write an ordinance to put down more specific numbers. And that's when we get the Land Ordinance of 1787. Basically, it was a refinement of the statehood process and the number of people required for statehood. But in a curious move, this is the first piece of legislation ever that banned slavery. The Ordinance of 1787 was written by Thomas Jefferson, and he banned slavery in any territory north of the Ohio River, which is down here. This was the first piece of legislation that done it, because remember, Thomas Jefferson hated slavery. He was a slave owner. I know, but he hated slavery. He was a slave. I know, but he hated slavery. Now, did the South freak out about this restriction? No. Why not? Because, guys, the reason why slavery was continued here in America is because that's how they thought they were going to get the labor for their cash crops. And even though I love Wisconsin, you can't grow cotton there. Even though I love Illinois and Chicago, you can't grow tobacco there. Indiana, you can't grow rice there. You can't. So basically, the cash crops couldn't grow there. So the South, they didn't really care. So now that we got the financial problem solved, do we have any other problems? You betcha. Next slide, diplomatic problems. You had trouble flaring with the British. I mean, in the Northwest Territory, where we were selling all this land, the British refused to vacate their forts. Not only that, but they were arming the Native Americans in the region. Now, of course, when we go to them and we say, hey, you need to get your forts out of there just like you said you'd do in the treaty, they simply say to us, oh, very well, good boy. And where is all the money that you said you'd pay us back in that same treaty? And we, of course, didn't have the money, so we'll just keep our forts there. Now, Ambassador John Adams goes over there, but he couldn't win any trade concessions from them at all. And the next country that we're having trouble with is Spain. Basically, Spain got all of France's land west of the Mississippi River due to their assistance with us in the Revolutionary War, and they got really freaked out by all of the immigrants that were pouring into Kentucky and Tennessee, because in their defense they had always used water to separate them from the enemy. Like when they were fighting off the Moors, they pushed the Muslims out of Spain, out of Gibraltar, and then they kind of left Africa alone. I mean, they took some small islands and little ports, but for the most part, they had that body of water. Well, what was the huge body of water? For them, it was the Mississippi River. And so basically they say, hey, Americans, you can't use the Mississippi River. What gave them the power to say that? They owned New Orleans, which is at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And any river, you control the mouth, you control the river. Well, we send John Jay to try to negotiate for American access, and he's unable to get any. Now, is this our only problem with foreign countries? No. We're having to mess with the Barbary pirates. Who were they? They were basically a group located off of the North African coast, places like Tripoli. And by 1785, our commerce had started spreading out so much that a New England merchant vessel that was sailing in the southern Mediterranean was seized by the Barbary pirates. And they said, pay off the ransom. We couldn't afford to pay the ransom, so the crew was sold into slavery. Now, would he do this to European ships? Well, basically, he was kind of like an OG, an old gangster. And if you paid a tribute to him, hey, you didn't have to worry. And here in America, we had no money for a navy. We had no money. So there'd be no protection. Blackmail. Now, is this the only problems we have? No. In like Western Massachusetts, there's difficulties going on there. Basically, the farmers in Western Massachusetts were deeply affected by the post-war depression. We fought for land and liberty, and it's hard if we can't enjoy either. Many of these farmers were deep into debt. The farmers protested against the high price of rents, the price of land, heavy taxes, debts, high judicial fees, and the fact that the central government couldn't even protect them against Indian raids and frontier bandits. So they asked the government to pass stay laws. What's a stay law? Basically, it's a law that suspends the rights of creditors to foreclose on debtors. For example, some people might get financial aid when they go to college. That's a loan from the government. And the government has a stay law built into that, saying that you don't have to start paying back this loan until 6 months after you've graduated. Why? Because they understand you're going to have to find a job, you're going to have the expenses of setting up your life. So they give you that grace. So these farmers protest the government, like the lower house, House of Representatives, they agree with them. The upper house, these are the rich guys who are owed a lot of the money, they totally disagree. And the stay laws are shot down. Then, to add insult to injury, they not only refuse to print more money, but they also raise taxes. So what do the farmers do? Well, pretty much they believe it's time for action. In 1786. And they rise up and they attack a local debtors court, closing it down, freeing all the imprisoned debtors, which gives a lot of excitement. Merchants accuse a 39-year-old veteran of Bunker Hill of leading this revolt. His name was Daniel Shays, which is why the Farmers' Revolt is also called Shays' Rebellion. And as they start going around closing more and more debtors' courts, freeing the farmers, more and more people join their side. Well, the state government can't have this. So they raise up a 600-man army under General William Shepherd, and they march to Springfield, Massachusetts, where 1,000 farmers armed only with pitchfork begin to march on Shepherd and his men. Shepherd waits, the farmers advance, and when the farmers finally get within range, he opens up the cannon fire, killing 4 rebels, and almost immediately the farmers go, "Oh, shoot," and they disperse. By February 4th, 1787, a group of more than 4,000 state militia surprised the remaining rebels. Even though Daniel Shays was able to escape. Now notice that the farmers' actions reflected the same steps that had been taken against the British. Petition, protest, and then revolt. And this revolt caused many to doubt the success of the state governments to uphold the law. And it renewed fears of revolts, including slave revolts, and notice how the government of Massachusetts had acted despite the warnings of Washington, who said, listen, if their grievances are real, then they should be responded to. So what does this lead to? It leads to a revolt of the better sort. Basically, critics of the Confederation government believed the United States faced a grave crisis. They cited the weak government, the quality of Congress's members, diplomatic problems, and heck, Shays' Rebellion. We have states that can't even control their own people. Indeed, of the Confederate government, George Washington claimed that it was the worst consequences from a half-starved, limping government, always moving upon crutches, tottering at every step. They knew that America could become a great nation if it had a unifying government that could tax, enforce national policies, stabilize trade practices, and preserve property. So leading Virginians convened a meeting at Annapolis to discuss trade problems and other conflicts among the states. Now that's just what they told the delegates to get them there. The real purpose of this government was to lay the groundwork for establishing a new government. Indeed, only a third of the states actually participated in this. But the delegates convinced Congress to call a convention in Philadelphia in 1787 to discuss trade between the states and governmental reform. And if anybody doubted that this needed to be done, all they would have to do is remind them of Shays' Rebellion. Creating a new government. So the very first decision they had to make is, are we going to revise the old government or just replace it? Kind of like when you have an old car. Are you going to keep fixing it, or is it just going to be better to just buy a totally new car? That's the question they had to ask. So late in May of 1787, George Washington called the convention to order in Philadelphia, where delegates from 12 of the 13 states were present. Only Rhode Island didn't send delegates, so it was called Rogue Island. Oh my. Most of these 55 delegates were men of means, lawyers, merchants, and planners. Important people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams weren't about. The guys basically who were going to be deciding these were economic giants, not philosophical. So are we going to revise or replace it? Well, the Virginia Plan advocated rejection of the Articles and the creation of a stronger system of government. This plan had been made up by a 36-year-old James Madison, who was small, frail, charmless, but he was a well-respected scholar of philosophy and political science. And he concluded that the fear of tyranny should not rule out a strong central government. Basically, Madison wanted a government that was strong not only to control the governed, but also it was obliged to control itself. So he built a government with 3 branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial, that each had the power of checking and balancing the other 2. Well, now, how is there going to be representation in Congress? Ready for the next slide? Well, large states, they really liked the Virginia plan that was going to have 2 houses, or be bicameral, where the number of members in each house would be based on the population, which was really favored by the large states. Small states were like, no way, we're going to have a unicameral Congress or a one-house Congress. Each state was going to have the same number of representatives. So everybody's equal, and the small states really like this one. So a great compromise was called for. Basically, the Great Compromise gave us a 2-house legislature where membership in the lower house would be based on a state's population. That's the House of Representatives. And in the upper house, there'd be totally equal membership, or the Senate, where each state has 2 senators. Well, how are members of Congress going to be elected? Well, that was also settled by a compromise. The upper house was to be elected by the state legislatures, or all the senators would be elected by the state legislatures. The House of Representatives, though, would be elected by the state's eligible voters. Well, what are we going to do about slaves? Well, the Three-Fifths Compromise was put in where every 5 slaves would be counted as 3 people. Now, how in the world could something like that got through? Well, basically, they were going to end the slave trade immediately, but some white Southerners, or some Southerners, because there were blacks as well as Native Americans that also owned slaves, wanted a 20-year extension to be put on the slave trade, because a lot of them had lost some slaves during the Revolution. Either they joined the British or fled to the back country. So the government said, okay, tell you what, we'll extend the slave trade by 20 years, but for every 5 slaves you have, they're only going to count as 3 people. To try to weaken the legislative power and representation of slave states. And some Southerners, like George Mason, saw a terrible dichotomy arise where it pretty much made all slave owners in this land of the free into nothing but petty tyrants. Ready to go to the next slide? Drafting an acceptable document. Well, the whole concept of checks and balances guided the assignment of powers to the President and Congress. Like the President or the executive branch was named Commander-in-Chief of all the armed forces, primarily responsible for foreign affairs, given veto power, and could appoint federal judges. Congress, or the legislative branch, they were given the power to declare war and to raise an army. Also, they had the power of the purse. And if the president vetoed something, you could override that veto with a 2/3 vote. And even though the president got to appoint federal judges, Congress had to approve them. And then we get to the Electoral College. And the Electoral College Compromise solved the controversy over participation by ordinary voters electing the president. Because, guys, that was such a new concept that they figured this would be a good stopgap. Even though it's also a great way that states get strong representation in the decision of who's our presidents. Especially the smaller, weaker states, they have, in proportionality, an electoral college representation that's larger than they would be if they were in a state like Texas. That as of this year will be the second most populated state in the United States. Ready to go to the next slide? Resolving the conflict of vision. Okay, the ratification controversy. By September of 1787, the Constitution was ready. And to ratify this, some tactics were used, like they had state conventions were called Now, of course, these state conventions were, it was said, to give the people a larger voice in the choice, but this allowed them to bypass the state legislatures of the Confederation government, who were dead set against this new system. And it also allowed them to directly nominate supporters of their program. To win ratification, they also started calling themselves the Federalist. They had changed their name from the Nationalist to Federalist, which connotated a strong state government and a limited national government, which is what the other side was actually more like, but it cheats them out of the name. So the opposition, they call themselves the Anti-Federalists, because they believe that a strong central government was a threat to states' rights. Each state only got one vote. Having to decide which way they wanted to go, either Federalist or Anti-Federalist. And only 9 states had to approve of being under the Constitution for victory. Ready for the next slide? Now, basically, as you guys could guess, local conditions often dictated positions for and against the Constitution. Votes in states with strong economies tended to be against the Constitution because they still had lots of power underneath the Confederation. If you were a small, weaker state, however, you tended to be in favor of it. Urban residents tended to be in favor. Backcountry and rural inhabitants tended to be against and oppose it. Now, the other side, the Anti-Federalists, they argued, they said, look, we're not in a crisis. The Federalists are nothing but a bunch of elitists. And if we actually vote for this Constitution, it's going to lead to tyranny because it had no Bill of Rights. You had a lot of famous revolutionaries that were Anti-Federalists, people like Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, George Clinton, who was a popular governor of New York. Ready to go to the next slide? And you don't have to write this down, but Virginia delegate George Mason said the government will set out a moderate aristocracy. It is at present impossible to foresee whether it will, in its operation, produce a monarchy or a corrupt tyrannical aristocracy. It will most probably vibrate for some years between the two and then terminate in the one or the other. Now, is this a true statement? Well, we're still kind of vibrating. And as long as because we're nothing more than an experiment, guys. And as long as we're still vibrating, that's awesome. Okay, the Federalist victory. Well, local conditions proved important in winning approval of the Constitution. The small states like Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, they quickly approve it. I mean, even though Rhode Island didn't. In Pennsylvania, Anti-Federalists lost control of the meeting and therefore their support. And in the remaining states of Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, the sides were matched. So the Federalists had to make deals to win support. Like for Massachusetts, they had to promise Samuel Adams that they'd affix a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. And when they agree to do that, Sam Adams pretty much gets the delegation to vote for the Constitution. In Virginia, the sides were pretty even. And Washington's influence, because he was such a hero, proved decisive in letting it go for the Constitution. And as 10 states had already voted for it, New York went ahead and they said, okay, we'll have the Constitution too. And they voted yes on July 26, 1788. So now we're going to have a brand new government. And who is going to be our first leader? Well, guys, it really wasn't a discussion over our first leader was going to be. Our first president was going to be George Washington. The choice was simple. He was the only nationally known individual that was loved by all. And he was promptly elected to the president by the Electoral College, even though he hadn't petitioned for the position. John Adams was his vice president. And as he made his way to America's first capital in New York City in April of 1789, the crowds are going crazy. Near Trenton, the site of his first revolutionary victory, he passed through a triumphal arch 20 feet high, supported by 13 pillars. And as the barge took him across the river, private boats floated alongside with supporters singing hymns dedicated to Washington. Now, guys, you could let that go to your head. Thank God Washington didn't. He knew the path ahead would be troubled. Indeed, his advisor, James Madison, said, "We are in a wilderness without a single footstep to guide us." And Washington knew and weighed each step that he took, because he knew that it would establish historical precedents. So what are some of the precedents that he helped establish? Well, the first is, what is the title? What do we call the president? The most powerful man in the United States, and now if you think about it, one of the most powerful people in the world. What do we call him? Well, guys, just think of every press conference you've ever seen. Mr. President, we call our leader Mr. Next, he established the whole idea of having a cabinet. You want to be a success? Surround yourself with successful people. So we got like Alexander Hamilton to be head of the Treasury. Henry Knox was the Secretary of War. Virginian Edmund Randolph served as Attorney General. And Virginian Thomas Jefferson served as Secretary of State. Now, guys, when you get all these super geniuses together, it could work really good, or it could lead to problems. And we kind of have problems. Competing visions re-emerge. Now, for a little while, there was unity. Indeed, Congress created a federal judiciary system with the Judiciary Act of 1787. This act created the federal court system and spelled out the powers of the Supreme Court. They approved of import duties to finance the government. And, just like they had promised, a Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. Well, unity was nice while we had it, but Hamilton's and Jefferson's differences emerge. As early as 1792, splits between the two start to appear. Basically, sectional divisions, differences in foreign policy and domestic affairs, split the unity of the government into two separate camps, embodied in Hamilton and Jefferson. Both are vastly different. Well, how are they different? Well, Hamilton, he wanted to be like the best. His followers were known as the Federalists. Basically, he wanted to be like Great Britain, who was the strongest power in the world at the time. He envisioned a economy rooted in manufacturing and commerce. He wanted tariffs and subsidies to help American industry, which of course made him very popular in the Northeast. But it scared the willies out of guys like Patrick Henry, who was horrified and proclaimed that this new government was a system which I have ever dreaded. Subserviency of Southern to Northern interests. Well, what about Thomas Jefferson? Well, his followers would be known as the Republican Democrats. And he basically viewed America as an agricultural society. He saw the potentiality of free trade to keep prices low. And he felt that industry should act as a handmaiden to agriculture. Because we grow so much food over here, what do people around the world need? They need food. If we're everybody's friend, they're going to be friends with us. And if we want to buy goods, we can simply buy the industrial goods from them through the sale of our crops. Ready for the next slide? Well, Hamilton's economic plan. Basically, guys, we have huge fiscal problems, which Hamilton detailed in his 1790 Report on Public Credit that he turned into Congress. Basically, it pointed out areas that needed attention. Like our foreign debts need to be paid off. Our state debts need to be paid off. All this money needed to be paid off with totally worthless continentals. So what Hamilton does is he proposes that the continentals be redeemed at face value. In other words, we're going to print out a new currency, and we're going to say that's worth $1, and we're going to give these continentals that are absolutely worthless, we're going to say the government's going to keep its word. Which, of course, Jefferson's followers, especially Madison, thought that this would be rewarding unscrupulous speculators, like the state treasuries of New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland had bought many of these continentals up when they were absolutely worthless. And Madison believed that gaining wealth by the manipulation of money was immoral. But Congress went ahead and approved it. Then Hamilton proposed that the government assume responsibility for all the state's debts. In other words, the federal government would go and take the debt that all the states had from the war. Well, the states would be like, oh man, that's great. We really need that money. But for Hamilton, because they paid off their debt, this would give the federal government the right to pass new taxes and limit the state's justification in imposing new ones. Now, some states like Virginia and Maryland, they had already paid off a lot of their debt. So they weren't really interested in this until Hamilton told them, tell you what, if you allow us to pay off your debt, we'll put the national capital in between Virginia and Maryland, where Washington, D.C. is located. Next, Hamilton secured the creation of a national bank. He wanted this bank modeled on the Bank of England that would tie national prosperity with the interests of an individual's wealth. The only problem is that the Constitution had given no authority for there to be a national bank. This is when we get into the whole implied versus literal power. People that are literally a literal reading of the Constitution or a strict construction of the Constitution says it's not in there, so it can't happen. A broad construction or an implied power would be, well, even though the Constitution doesn't say it, it says that the Congress is responsible for our money, printing money, and also we can regulate interstate trade. So even though it doesn't say it, it says it. We can have a national bank. It's an implied power. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, meanwhile, things are going bad with our once ally, France. Almost as soon as Washington entered office in 1789, the French Revolution began. Indeed, our old revolutionary ally, the Marquis de Lafayette, sent Washington the key to the Bastille, where the French Revolution began. And at the beginning, most Americans sympathized with the revolution in France. But then we start entering the reign of terror, where they start using the guillotine to cut off heads not only of the dukes and dames, but also of their maids and servants, and then the kids of those servants, and then the neighbors, and so on. And then they start dreaming of taking this liberté, égalité, et fraternité out of France and attacking the other kings of Europe. Indeed, Edmond Guéné, a Frenchman, arrived in Charleston, South Carolina in 1793 and tried to recruit a lot of South Carolinians to carry on a war with Spain. Now wait a minute, the Spain over in Europe? No, the Spain down in Florida, directly south of them. Well, Washington knows that he can't do this, so he orders Guéné arrested and sent back to France. Guéné gets back to France, and he realizes that all of his buds that sent him over here have been guillotined, and that if he wants to stay alive, he better hustle out of there. So he comes back over here to America, buys some land in upstate New York, and basically Washington knows that America cannot survive a war with a European power. So he declares Americans neutrality. Well, when Washington declares America neutral, Jefferson is outraged. He loved France. And he remembers when we were down, France signed that treaty with us. But Washington said, yeah, look, we signed it with their king and queen. That government is no longer ruling, and trying to figure out a way to get out of having to go to war. Well, because Washington says we're neutral, Jefferson resigns and walks out. And almost as soon as he walks out, he's like, oh crap, now I can't stop Hamilton from doing everything he wants to do. Ready to go to the next slide? And we have more domestic disturbances. Basically, the Federalists argue that the Republic was in danger from Jefferson and his followers, or from the Democratic Republicans. And in the wake of the French Revolution, you start to have British interference in the West and on the high seas. And at the state level, groups begin to organize, making demands from the government and to protest. And these Democratic Republican societies, or pro-French political groups, really worry Washington. Ready to go to the next slide? Meanwhile, you have farmers in Kentucky that want to navigate the Mississippi River. You have Pennsylvania and Carolina farmers angry over a new tax that's put on the production of whiskey. In July of 1794, a group of a few hundred citizens armed with pitchforks and rifles ransacked and burned the homes of a federal excise inspector and threatened to march on Washington if the whiskey tax wasn't repealed. Well, how does Washington react to this? Remember when it was Shays' Rebellion, he told the people of Massachusetts, hey, you should have listened to them if they had problems. Well, now that he's a big dog, he gets an army of 15,000 militiamen. Guys, this is 4 times as large as the armies that he would lead during the American Revolutionary War. And he marches out to go meet the farmers. But his whole way that he's marching out there, he tells everybody exactly what he's doing. And so, of course, as he's being totally honest, word is getting back to the farmers, hey, you guys better chill. So that when Washington actually gets out to the site, the farmers are gone. And that little rebellion is broken without any blood loss. And Washington blamed the the Republican Democrats for this difficulty. And Jefferson then tries to move protests to governmental arenas. Well, what ceased the farmers from being angry? Well, it was when Thomas Pinckney was able to work out the Treaty of San Lorenzo, which gave farmers the right to finally take their goods down the Mississippi River. So now there's new prosperity that makes people forget some of their limitations. Ready for the next slide? The Jay Treaty and diplomatic battle. Well, the British were really angered by our announcement of free trade. They see it basically as a gift to France. The friend of my enemy is my enemy. So from Canada, they begin to launch attacks by the Miami tribes on American settlements. So in Ohio, General Mad Anthony Wayne goes out to battle. Meanwhile, we send Chief Justice John Jay to begin negotiations with the British. And in this treaty, the Jay Treaty, basically England agrees to abandon their forts in the West. They even granted small trade favors to the United States and the West Indies. However, one of the reasons why they do that is because the U.S. agreed that all the pre-war debts to British merchants were finally going to be paid off. And on the biggest point, Jay really wanted Britain to recognize freedom of the seas, meaning you can't stop neutral vessels. Well, England wasn't going to have any of that, so Jay abandoned Americans' demands for freedom of the seas and conceded the British Navy's right to remove French property from neutral ships. This, of course, in America caused a huge backlash against the treaty. And it weakened somewhat the prestige and authority of Washington's government. Ready to go to the next slide? Meanwhile, Matt Anthony Wayne defeated Native American resistance at the Battle of Fallen Timbers up in the Northwest Territory, forcing the Native Americans to sign the Treaty of Greenville, where the Indians ceded title to all their lands in Ohio. And then the unthinkable. George Washington decided that he wasn't going to seek a third term. In the face of difficulties surrounding him, Washington decided against a third term. And guys, when he leaves office, it's a totally different America. We have the U.S. economy moving towards a market economy. Our trade is expanded. Markets are growing. Indeed, when King George III heard that George Washington had stepped away from power, King George III said, if this is true, then truly he is the greatest man of all. And he gave a farewell address. And in this address, he warned Americans against foreign entanglements. Because, like, if we hadn't gotten out of that France, the treaty we had made with France, even though we kind of used a sneaky way to do it, we might have been destroyed as a nation. Because America is nothing but a little bitty baby by this point. And the second thing that he warned the people about was the growth of political parties. Which may seem weird to you, but guys, remember, America is nothing but a beautiful and incredible experiment. And it seemed like it would be difficult for America to survive if there was a group out there that was against America from succeeding. Okay, guys, in our next lecture, we're going to be talking more about the growth of early America. All righty.